Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is Catalina Montoya. I'm the director of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies. And I would like to welcome you to this seminar series, Responding to Disruption, Government Populism, the Pandemic, and the Breakdown of Public Trust, organized by the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies, the MA in Politics and International Relations, and the European Institute at Liverpool Hope University. Now, what responses can be expected from international and national governments to reestablish trust in the efficacy of liberal and democratic politics? And what lessons, if any, have been learned? In this program of webinar Q&As, we have invited experts in their field to comment on pathways towards the reestablishment of public trust in a post-COVID, post-Brexit, and post-Trump environment. The Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies is proud to bring together academics and practitioners who work on issues related to peace, war, and conflict from a variety of perspectives. The Centre promotes the benefit of drawing on interdisciplinary approaches to shed light on the multidimensional challenges that are faced by militarism and deeply divided societies. Now, today's talk is entitled Trust, the Paris Agreement and COP26. And our special guest is Professor John Vogler, Professorial Research Fellow in International Relations at Kyoto University. He has been involved with the international relations of the environment over the last 3 decades and is the author of numerous publications, including Climate Change in World Politics, published in 2016 by Palgrave Macmillan. Currently, he's working on the prospects for COP26. And after John's presentation, we'll open the session to questions from the audience. So thank you so much, John, and thank you so much to all of our attendees for being here. And let's make a start.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. COP26, 26th meeting of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a delayed event, but it's a very big event, which is scheduled to occur in November. Whether it actually occurs in reality or whether it occurs virtually is still, as we shall see, up for discussion. It's an important event for the UK government, because in a way it's indicative, it's going to be symbolic of the government's post-Brexit ambitions for a global Britain, because the UK has the joint presidency of the COP with Italy. But it's worth stepping back for a moment and seeing that this is only the latest point in a very long journey of a regime that has been going for a pretty long time, as you see from the timeline on the screen, from the mid-1980s, when the science indicating that there was a problem with climate change began to firm up, and international action was first taken in terms of putting that science on an authoritative basis with the foundation of the intergovernmental, I stress intergovernmental panel on climate change, which I shall talk about in a minute. Since then, this has probably been the most extensive ever exercise in multilateral and very often public diplomacy. Now, what I'm going to do in this lecture is to consider what trust means in terms of these long-standing attempts at international governance of the climate change problem, and how significant trust might be in relation to a successful, and we'll have to define what we mean by successful, outcome in Glasgow. The Climate Change Convention has many functions. The obvious ones are that it is a knowledge gathering and assessment regime. It attempts, or has attempted, to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, not terribly successfully, as we shall see. The regime itself serves to avoid the problem of free riding on commitments that others have made, and this is a key issue in relation to trust, as I hope to demonstrate. And very important, it's also a regime that is about adaptation to existing ongoing climate change. And this brings us into the arena of North-South relations, which is not usually emphasized enough, in my view, in discussions of what is going on in the climate regime. Because remember, most of the members of the 192 plus members of the climate convention are developing states, are in the South. And their concerns are rather different from those of us in the more developed countries. So a lot of what the regime does is about adaptation to climate change, about capacity building, about aid, and about assistance for loss and damage arising from climate change. The other thing to say is, of course, there are many other functions of this regime, some of which are very political, involved with reputation, status, and all the rest of it. So there's a lot going on that is not captured by, if you like, the formal remit of the regime. In terms of meeting the regime's objectives, its original objective was in, I think, Article 2 of the original convention, the 1992 convention, was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. This has clearly not happened. Neither was its Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997 and came into force in 2005, successful. It only had a marginal impact on emissions. In fact, the Montreal Protocol, which is the famous protocol that deals with ozone depleting gases, that was much more, 5 or 6 times more successful than the Kyoto Protocol, simply because it reduced the chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere, and these also happen to be powerful greenhouse gases. So the Kyoto Protocol, whatever else it did, was not terribly successful in actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Since the Paris Agreement of 2015, the objective has been clearly stated to avoid rises in temperature above 2 degrees centigrade in relation to the pre-industrial figure, which is regarded as the threshold of dangerous climate change, although even that is disputed, but more particularly to try, if possible, to avoid rises above 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, we are now at about 1.1. If you look down on this image of the projected impacts of climate change, we're now at about 1.1. And we are heading quite fast towards 1.5. This graphic actually dates from 2007, and I tried to get a more up-to-date one, but this is the one that everybody still continues to use. I think one could modify it. If anything, I would increase the orange parts of the graphic, because things have become rather more alarming even than they were in 2007, particularly in relation to ice melt in the Arctic, but also something that I think ought to be on this graphic, the fact that 1.5 is significant because it's the point at which many small island developing states who have been quite significant in the development of climate politics would be inundated, would simply cease to exist. We're talking like Marshall Islands, Vanuatu, the Maldives, etc. So it's pretty critical for them. Now, the numbers are at the moment seriously going in the wrong direction. As I say, we're about 1.1 degrees centigrade in terms of temperature rise. If you put this in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide was about 280 parts per million. The safe level in terms of climate change is reckoned to be about 350 parts per million. We long ago passed that point. If you look at, I think I looked at The Guardian the other day, and along with the weather forecast, they give you the readings from an island in the Pacific as to parts per million carbon dioxide. The last time I looked, we were at 419 parts per million and rising. As I say, if you're trying to associate this with temperature rises, once you get to about, I think, 445, 450, you are exceeding the limits that are in the Paris Agreement. So the situation, I don't have to remind you, I think is pretty serious. Now, like any good student, we're trying to think about the governance response to all this. I tried to define my terms, as one is supposed to do at the beginning of any essay. And I thought, well, there are two essential meanings of trust if we're looking at a problem like climate change. The first set of meanings are the obvious ones relating to behavior, to trust in other people's behavior or distrust of other people's behavior. And you can see I've broken this down into three types of trust. There is pretty basic transactional trust about enforceable contracts, etc. There's a stronger form of trust, which I've called institutionalized trust, which tends to characterize longer-term relationships, which are likely to be more trusting than fairly short-term transactions. And then, I think we talked about this the other day, there is another sort of generalized moral compulsion, which is not often found in the international system. The other area, of course, which is terribly important and absolutely foundational to climate change is trust in the science. So there is another dimension of this which relates to the authority of science, to trust in findings, to trust in evidence, to trust in, if you like, the scientific method. And it's related to an ability to think about these things and to think about probabilities, for example. Now, of course, these are analytically separate. I don't know whether you buy into these thoughts about trust or not, but they're analytically separate. But in reality, they are very interconnected. And you've only got to think, for instance, about the recent politics over vaccines and over the pandemic to see how connected they are. The way in which scientific authority and trust in scientific authority has been absolutely critical to the way in which both the government and its opponents present their case. Trusting the science, following the science, etc., etc. Do we believe it? Can we trust it? And there is an enormous premium on scientific authority, whether coming from SAGE or elsewhere. So those are my dimensions of trust that I'm going to use in trying to unpick the trust dimensions of the climate change regime. I'm going to start with scientific trust. This is absolutely fundamental to the climate regime and has its origins, as I think I've already said, in the 1980s with scientific concern that something was going on with the climate and the sponsorship by a large number of international bodies of ongoing studies of what exactly was going on. And that is a graphic that dates from that period. You can see, I think my previous boss once said, this is the alphabet soup. This is when I was working for the SRC. This, how Newby said, this is the alphabet soup of international environmental science. And it certainly is, and it's probably got worse since then. But fundamental to that, and at its heart, as you see, is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel, which was set up by the Environment Programme Unit, but also by the WMO, the Meteorological Organization. There's a social science bit, which is right down the left-hand corner, the Human Dimensions Programme, which is a relatively marginal part of this enterprise with which I once had some dealings. Here's the IPCC. Now, what the IPCC does is to bring together most of the world's climate scientists to try and to issue assessments, periodic assessments, which are known as the TAR and the FAR, the Force Assessment Report, and they come out every 5 or 6 years, which are supposed to provide us with an authoritative view of climate change. It's got 3 working groups that consider not only the basic science, which is working group 1, but also what one might do about it and the economics of it, and so on and so forth, particularly working group 3. This is a scientific process. It's a scientific process that's dominated by developed world scientists, because that's the way, that's the structure of scientific endeavor. It's also, again, inevitably highly political. So the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have to go through political vetting, particularly the executive summary, which is the thing people tend to read, has to go through political vetting, and that by government representatives. The Framework Convention on Climate Change is a framework adjustable protocol convention, and it's specifically designed in order to take into account scientific results, scientific findings on what's going on in the environment. And although the IPCC is not part of the Climate Change Convention, it talks to it all the time. And as in the recent 1.5 degrees report, the convention actually requests IPCC to do work. The convention has its own subsidiary body, the SBSTA, the subsidiary body for science and technology, that actually reviews a lot of the science. So the elusive goal here is authoritative science, the kind of science that policymakers can believe. And you could, and I would, I think, regard the UN Convention as a giant knowledge engine since 1992, even before that. And one of its major foci has been on what we call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, of which are lots more in a minute. Originally, if you sign the convention, the 1992 convention, it did not have any binding, you would not have a binding commitment as a country to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. You were urged to do so, but there was never a binding commitment because it was vetoed by the United States. It didn't want to have binding commitments on such things. And the main commitment, the main obligation that you have and still have as a state, as a member of the Climate Change Convention, is reporting, is drawing up a national inventory of sources and sinks of greenhouse gases and reporting these in a series of national communications to the Secretariat of the UNFCCC. So that is an ongoing process. It's important to say that although these reports were pretty authoritatively produced by this great engine of the IPCC and then the UNFCCC, there was widespread and evidently self-interested skepticism, even denial of these findings. In 2005, for example, this is before the G8 summit in Gleneagles, they were sat in Whitehall on the eve of the summit trying to negotiate, as they do, the communique, and the Americans, they have bracketed text, and there was a piece of bracketed text that said, "We know that climate change is occurring." And this kept them, and this was a matter of contention all morning because the Americans wished to strike this out of the communique. I don't think the Biden administration would do that now, but back in 2005, it was as disputed as that you couldn't even put that in an agreed communique. And of course, we've lived through the experience of the Trump administration where the science of climate was actively denied and went to extreme length in this. Countries still do this to a certain, only some countries still do this, I think now. The Russians and the Saudis, for example, refused to welcome a recent IPCC report. It just didn't suit them politically. So there's always been this difficult situation with the scientific knowledge, with trust in the scientific knowledge. And unfortunately, authoritative science has proved elusive because there are so many people with a self-interest in denying it. I have to say, I think this is now reduced. So the level of trust has greatly increased. And you can see that, and BBC is in the news, of course, this morning. One of the indicators of this is the BBC no longer treats climate change as a contested political issue. Go back about 5 years, and they treated it, if you had somebody on from the IPCC, you had to dredge up somebody who would deny it all because this was a matter of political dispute. They don't do this anymore, but they did do it a few years ago. So I think that's an indicator that the trust in the science has now developed, but with a few outliers, of course. I know that included the Trump administration. So that's the first issue. Once you start attempting to do something other than gather information about climate change, which they attempted to do in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, once you start emissions reduction, then other sorts of trust come into play that I have defined as behavioral and transactional. Because there is a danger, fundamentally, that if one country, or we agree to cut our emissions, there will be economic costs and there are incentives to cheat. That is why I think the second function of a body like the Climate Change Convention, not only to gather information, but to deal with what the economists call the free riding problem. That how can you be sure that if you make sacrifices, if you reduce your emissions, others will not take advantage of this and cheat and gain economic advantage? And what the Kyoto Protocol did was to create a set of commitments by developed world states to reduce their emissions by 2008, 2012, and there were fixed targets. This was a top-down system. The Americans very quickly withdrew from this, but the Europeans remained in, as did other countries, Australia and Japan. Note, this was very much something that was for developed countries, because one of the main principles of the convention was common but differentiated responsibilities. That meant that if anybody was going to take immediate action on climate change, it had to be the developed countries. And that's fundamental principle of the regime, well, it was then anyway. Now, ironically, because they later pulled out, the Americans insisted that if they were going to be part of reducing emissions, they had to have market-based mechanisms to help them do it. And these are the famous flexibility mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, emissions trading, and particularly CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. This is an offset mechanism whereby if, for example, the Japanese wish to spend some money on reducing the emissions from a power station, if they spend $1 million yen on doing that in Japan, they will get minimal results because they already have pretty efficient power stations. However, if they spend this somewhere else in the developing world, they will remove a lot of carbon dioxide. So the idea is that if you pay people in other countries to make cuts in their emissions, you can use these against your own emissions targets. And that's what the Clean Development Mechanism is, and joint implementation is a form of this between developed countries. Now, once you start doing this, there are enormous opportunities for fraud and sharp practice, and there were with the Clean Development Mechanism. And the most disputed issue in developing the Kyoto Protocol that took the most time to negotiate were the very extensive monitoring and compliance and facilitation methods that were going to be used to keep people honest in relation to running the flexibility mechanisms. In fact, China was the main beneficiary of CDM funding. So once you start reducing emissions, once you start building these mechanisms, there are enormous opportunities for cheating, and people get extremely suspicious. So you have the most complex set of MRV ever, I think, much more complex than that would occur, for instance, for arms control, involving independent expert review teams, and as I say, facilitation branch and so on. And this is ongoing because although the Kyoto Protocol has pretty much come to an end, there is Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, which covers carbon trading. And you've probably seen in the news that the one big issue they haven't managed to agree on in relation to implementing the Paris Agreement is Article 6. And it's for these reasons, because it deals with trading and carbon markets, where there are, people are very, very suspicious and want everything nailed down. So this is an ongoing problem with the Paris Agreement on carbon trading. So you can see lots of examples of distrust and the need to absolutely verify things before you sign up to an agreement. Very similar to what you get in arms control, only much more complicated. Much more complicated, for instance, because in arms control negotiation, trust and verify, you usually only agree on things that you can count. And there are special rules about how you count rockets and other military facilities. It's much more complicated with climate change because you're having to assess things like additionality and sustainability in the CDM. So it's even more complicated and difficult in climate change. So transactional trust is to the fore in all of this, and all distrust. If I have a little theoretical departure here, there are underlying assumptions, as we've seen, of bad faith and distrust. As I say, similar to the situation in arms control, but much more complicated. The problem is often portrayed in the literature as a prisoner's dilemma when you are negotiating about these things. And I'm sure you're aware of this classic formulation: two criminals interrogated separately in the absence of communication and in the absence of trust. A rational player, a rational criminal in this case, protects his interests because as you can see, there is a danger if he cooperates with the other player and the other player doesn't cooperate, then he gets 3 years and the other player goes free. So the optimal strategy, where all these one-shot prisoner's dilemma always end up, is that both sides get the best of the worst alternatives by defecting. And that's a one-shot prisoner's dilemma. It's a classic in the study of conflict communication and cooperation. But this only holds in a one-shot game where neither side trusts the other. In effect, we don't really have one-shot games. What happens if we put our distrustful players into a more continuous interaction, which of course is in the case of an ongoing institution like the Climate Change Convention? Well, here I want to refer to two, I think, very important, very heuristic, to use the word, pieces of social science research about the institutionalization of trust, which I think are relevant to studying the Climate Change Convention. The first is by the man on the left. There he is receiving a medal from President Obama. That is Robert Axelrod. Now, Robert Axelrod wrote a very important work some years ago called The Evolution of Cooperation. And what he did was he took the prisoner's dilemma game that we've just seen and played it on a computer, as a computer game, with all the game theory experts that he could round up. And they all were told to develop a winning strategy for a prisoner's dilemma game over 40 plays, i.e. an iterated prisoner's dilemma. An iterated prisoner's dilemma is one where there is the shadow of the future, that you have to take into account what other people will do on the next round of the game. And he had a very interesting result, which was there was a winning strategy. This may be useful for you, I don't know, in your conduct of your daily life, but the winning strategy in a prisoner's dilemma, according to Axelrod, is tit for tat. That is to say, on the first move, you cooperate. If the other side defects, you defect. If they cooperate, then you cooperate, and so forth. That always wins. You get the highest payoff over 40-shot iterated prisoner's dilemma. So what is the implication of this? It's quite important, actually, and Axelrod gives a very, very good example of this related to the trenches in the First World War. Think of his scenario. Think of the scenario here. There are two, there's a trench, and on one side are the Württembergers, and the other side is sort of the Staffordshire Regiment, or the King's Liverpool Regiment, or whatever you like. And they're firing at each other on a daily basis. And one day, they can't communicate. one day, and it's very irritating for both of them because come up properly. One day, one side stops shelling at breakfast time, and the other side stops shelling at breakfast time, and a pattern begins to develop. If somebody shoots, they shoot back. So what you had in the trenches was implicit cooperation in an iterated prisoner's dilemma. They both found a solution. It's very interesting. And the High Command got wind of this form of implicit cooperation that went on. And of course, their answer was to move the units, which they did, to stop this sort of cooperation developing. So one element of this is what happens with the shadow of the future, an iterated prisoner's dilemma. The other person I think is important theoretically in studying these problems of trust and cooperation is Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom is the only political scientist ever to have won a Nobel Prize in economics. And there she is on the screen receiving a Nobel Prize for economics. Her life was devoted to studying small-scale commons governance. And there are some analogies between very small-scale attempts to deal with pollution in a commons, where you're dealing with something, the equivalent of the atmosphere. You're dealing with a common resource that you can't parcel up into individual pieces of property. And contrary to those like Garrett Hardin, who argued that this would inevitably lead to terribly self-interested, distrustful behavior where everybody was out for themselves in the short term and the collective consequence was ruin, what Elinor Ostrom established was that if you empirically looked at how actual commons were governed, they weren't like that. That there were institutionalized forms of regulation that managed to deal with problems like the problem of free riding. There were social institutions whereby neighbors understood, developed a set of rules and kept to them. And there were serious penalties for breaking those rules, particularly in terms of your reputation amongst your neighbors. So a fascinating study of how cooperation exists and how problems of trust and distrust are managed, you can find in the work of Elinor Ostrom, particularly her 1990 work governing commons, but subsequent work like polycentric governance and so on. So these give us some ideas with which we can look at problems of trust in the Paris Agreement and onwards. Well, here we have the Paris Agreement. I always like that cartoon. Sort of nostalgic in a way. How has trust been built in the climate regime? As I say, there are analogies to what the work of Axelrod and Ostrom. Can we see a move from strictly transactional trust to something which is more institutionalized, which respects the shadow of the future? I think we can. I mean, one of the things about the climate regime is that it's very heavily institutionalized over a long term. I mean, the same people turn up every year, the government officials. It is understood that violations will be observed and will be publicized. And in fact, they developed, as we've seen, a huge mechanism for doing this. On the other hand, its performance has not been good. But I think there is evidence, if you look at the way in which the structures of the regime have developed, there is evidence that there is not the level of extreme distrust that one sees in other areas. And this is partly because the thing is so heavily institutionalized in relation to what Axelrod was talking about. The other thing I think you can see, if you start digging into how the regime operates, is that the technical specialists and expert groups are like little commons communities. They're like sociological communities. Now, one example of this and how trust develops, you can ask the question, I mean, I asked the question to one of the people who drew up the national inventories for carbon dioxide emissions. I said, how can you trust that your colleagues in China or elsewhere are not fiddling the books, not fiddling the figures? And he gave me a very interesting answer. He said, we would know if they tried to do this because we all go to the same conferences. We know each other. We trust each other. We have that sort of intimate knowledge. So there isn't a problem in a way, because we're like, you know, they're like the villagers on the common who can observe what their neighbours are doing, and they all know each other, and they know there are reputational penalties for trying to cheat. So I thought that was very interesting. And in fact, although one is dealing with this great big regime of, you know, of nation states at the highest level, at the COP and so on and so forth, at the lower levels of actually making the thing function, there are these quite important little scientific transnational, in a way, communities. And some of the dynamics that Ostrom observes exist there, I think. My task is to look at the post-2020 regime and COP26. What was the, as I say, Kyoto in many ways failed, although we are still, many of the structures related to Kyoto are still with us in the Paris regime. The Paris regime, and this is the key thing to note about it, the Paris Agreement is very different from Kyoto. For a start, remember I talked about common but differentiated responsibilities and the way in which under Kyoto only developed countries had to make emissions reductions. The point is, it is universal, and it had to be universal because you know, the main emissions in the future are going to come from developing countries, partly because we transfer some of our dirtiest processes to developing countries, and we transfer much of our heavy industry to China, for example. So it's got to be universal, and that was an American demand throughout, really, that you have to have a universal regime for mitigation. So it's everybody's in it. Everybody's got to do mitigation under the Paris Agreement. But there are subtle forms of differentiation, which you can read if you study the agreement, you know, which can be as much as the developed countries shall, but developing countries should. And you could read that in the text of the Paris Agreement. But so that's one point, it's universal. But the cost of this is that it is not like Kyoto, a top-down regime which has determined commitments to which countries are legally bound. It's not like that at all. It's a bottom-up regime of what are known as not as commitments, but, quote, nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. Now, this is key, you know, this is key to what is going on at the moment, because the original nationally determined contributions, if you put them all together, as we shall see in the next graphic, don't amount to anything like keeping below 2 degrees centigrade. So the key to this is uprating the nationally determined contributions, and it is hoped that this will happen this year at COP26. The key mechanism is what you can describe as a pledge and review mechanism. That is to say, countries will make pledges to uprate their nationally determined contributions, and others will be impressed by that and follow on. It's an emulative process. But obviously, monitoring, reporting, and verification is going to be important, because you've got to believe that other people are making realistic pledges. So this is a ratchet mechanism that is embedded. This is at the heart of the Paris Agreement, and it's a mechanism of pledge and review, and it's supposed to eventuate 2023 in what is given in the agreement as a global stocktake. And as I say, the second round of NDC pledges is going on now. MRV, ensuring there isn't any cheating, ensuring that pledges are trustworthy, is, as usual, fundamental to this. And you'll be happy to know that the Paris Agreement has spent a lot of time developing what is known as the Enhanced Transparency Framework. That is just a very simple graphic on what this involves in reporting, technical expert review, and facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, etc. And there are there are quite serious differences here between developed and developing countries. You can see why the Enhanced Transparency Framework, for all its complexity, is very significant. And the other thing I would say about this is, as always in the climate change regime, there has to be an element of support for developing countries that simply do not have the capabilities to do all the monitoring and reporting that is required under these rules. So an important part of the MRV of the Paris Agreement is this enhanced transparency framework. The problem is, of course, that if you look at what countries have pledged to do, they are well short of what is required. The current NDC pledges, as I say, are well below what is required. I think the latest update from the Secretariat is that it will lead to increases of about 3 degrees, which is not good enough in terms of in terms of what we need to do. The key to this is not only making, as you've probably seen in the press, very sort of airy net zero by 2050, or in the case of China, 2060 pledges. The key, if you can see it if you look at that graphic, is making serious cuts of about 50% in your greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and that's the significant thing to watch for, as opposed to the very long-term net zero commitments. Recent climate diplomacy involves, in advance of COP26, involves a strange period in which there are major meetings. This is a recent one that the Americans sponsored, but the British, of course, as president, have sponsored them as well, in which national politicians, national leaders appear on Zoom screens like this and make pledges, some of which have very little veracity. And the key issue here is, what are the reputational dynamics going on here? Are we seeing the ratchet effect, or is a lot of this just hot air? And can we, as it were, differentiate between the virtue signaling here and actual real intentions to cut emissions? The other angle on this, I think, which is important, is the fact that the normal diplomacy that usually precedes a COP, whereby there are lots of interim meetings and drafting of positions and so on, have not been able to occur properly because of the pandemic. And that's been a serious problem. And under consideration now is the critical question of whether the meeting in Glasgow will actually go ahead physically, or whether it has to be one of these rather strange Zoom meetings, online virtual meetings. And developing countries in particular say that although they are prepared to have an interim meeting now, there has to be a face-to-face COP with all that implies in terms of vaccinations and safety and quarantine and such like. Coming to the end of my remarks, you'll be glad to hear, Catalina, now. The other big issue, and I'm afraid I should have put it first rather than leaving it to the end, is finance and adaptation. If you look for the biggest area of distrust in the climate regime, it has to be in the relations between North and South. It was particularly evident at Copenhagen, the Copenhagen COP, where it looked as if a few big countries, the United States and China, had cooked up a deal which disregarded everybody else, which was a cause of serious distrust in the whole system. As I say, the developing countries demand that they get adaptation finance, because climate change is happening now, and they need the finance, and they also need loss and damage funding, particularly for small island developing states that have been destroyed by climate changes. So this is a bitter, ongoing problem, which also relates to MRV, because one of the things developing countries demand is proper MRV for adaptation funding, because very often it's quite possible to repackage aid pledges and make them seem much bigger than they are, just as in the same way for the ratchet mechanism to work, you need MRV in relation to the kind of metrics that are used in measuring emissions. So you must, as I said at the beginning, most of the parties are developing countries, and this is a huge and important and increasing issue, and will be so at COP26. Here are my conclusions. First, the bad news. Kyoto did not work. The impact of Paris is still uncertain. Existing pledges are way off what is required to keep below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. As we said, about 3 degrees, if you look at it now. Significant areas of mistrust remain, as I say, especially in North-South relations and in haggling over carbon trading and Article 6. Now, finally, 2 bits of good news. Self-interested mistrust of scientific findings on the actuality of climate change has abated, especially now that Trump has gone. And one very good example of this, I think, is last week's report by the United States EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Something was suppressed by the Trump administration that acknowledges that the US is itself a victim of a changing climate. And this may be very, very significant because as opposed to being an act of altruism for other countries, you could start to see reducing emissions as something which is very much in the US national interest. I think that's very significant. The other point, of course, is that it's very difficult to deny climate science now because you can see, because the realities of climate change are now in plain sight. It's not a matter of debating whether the extrapolations of the IPCC in 2050 are potentially correct or not. You can see things going on now. The final thing I want to say in terms of mitigation and the big problem of free riding, which is always mentioned in relation to international environmental agreements, is some of the key assumptions, underlying assumptions, are now challenged because of the falling cost of renewables and a growing acceptance of the ultimate need for a net zero economy, and that money may be made, an economic advantage may be made, can be had by doing the right thing. The key assumption that used to prevail is that there is some sort of trade-off between economic welfare and emissions reduction. Very much the case in 1997 when the US Senate voted against Kyoto and said, we cannot restrict our emissions, put taxes on carbon if our competitors in China will be able to use this to outcompete us in industrial terms. Now, this kind of logic looks like it is receding, and therefore some of the incentives to cheat are removed, and the dangers of free riding may be lessened. Now, I'm not saying they're gone away. I mean, you can see from the Article 6 discussions that they haven't. But I have a sense that even in China and the way Chinese policy is developing, they are now grasping the opportunities, the economic welfare opportunities of actually doing the right thing in emissions reductions. So the economic incentives are shifting, and that's a good thing in terms of distrust. We hope that this will drive the Paris ratchet mechanism in a virtuous direction. But at the moment, this remains a hope. Thanks very much. I will cease here. I will stop share, okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor John Vogler, for a really comprehensive and really interesting talk. If you allow me, perhaps, and before our attendees start writing and sharing their questions and comments with us through the Q&A tool, may I ask you perhaps to refer and expand on the role of Britain and its leadership in the face of COP26? What are your thoughts on Britain particularly?
Oh goodness, yeah. It's well, the first thing to say is this was a very fortuitous opportunity that was seized in relation to ambitions for global Britain, because it puts us in the spotlight. It comes together with G7 leadership, which is another, because the G7 is involved in this. It's going to meet in Cornwall, and they're all going to admit that. One of the things they hope to do is to pressure the Australians who've been invited to the G7 to come on board with the 2030 commitment. again, on the theme of trust, of course, it is important that if we are attempting to lead as we are, one of the problems with climate is there are too many leaders. Who probably knows that everybody wants to be a leader, but if we're going to lead, then we have to put in place, and I think we have done some very advanced targets in relation to where we want to be in 2030. I mean, 80% reductions and very very impressive targets in relation to your domestic heating, cars, electric cars, etc. So all of this is in place. The difficulty is going to be delivering it, and in a credible way, against trust. And there are other things that have been unfortunate in terms of, we are putting in a great deal of diplomatic effort to this. I mean, Alex Sharma is working on it full time, and a number of other people. So they are putting in a lot of diplomatic effort. I don't think it helps that we're outside the EU, because the EU, I haven't mentioned the EU. The EU has been a major player in climate change politics. And I'm straying off your question now, but the downside of this is we're operating beyond the EU. And the EU, you know, there are three big players in climate politics, because they're the three big economies. There's the US, China the biggest player, and EU. And what it really does, in mitigation terms, it really doesn't matter what they decide to do. And we were in a much stronger position within the EU than we are now, partly because we were one of the leaders in the EU, along with the Germans, for pushing for climate action. And you know, the UK, the other thing the UK has got is a very strong science base still. And you know, there are ways in which the government has undercut this. And then you add to it the you know, the retreat from the 0.7, which is serious. I banged on about at the end the north-south dimension of climate change. And if you're trying to get people to take action, if you're trying to say that there will be adaptation finance, and if you're trying to bolster the science base, then cutting your the aid budget in the way they've done, it does not help. So there are counterbalancing factors, and we could go on about the coal mine as well. And, you know, that's not good. So there's a certain amount of confusion in government policy. Some of it is very virtuous and goes in the right direction and is internationally impressive, but other bits are not. I don't think we're unique in this, but I mean, I can talk about the EU if you want.
And here for the EU, perhaps, Professor Mike Manning, would you like to, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. Is there anything you'd like to comment and ask perhaps to Professor John Vogler around maybe tying up a little bit with the EU? You're muted.
He's muted.
Okay. Are you there? Yeah, can you hear me?
He's gone mute again.
You muted yourself again.
Okay. Sorry, John. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good. I was going to ask you about the EU and its particular role. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, but also the role of the UK at the moment, and these conflicting messages that you implied. I think they're quite big. We've just ducked away from domestic policy associated with climate change, which is very interesting. And here I'm in France, and I'm rung up almost every other day with people asking whether I need any assistance in my heating, improving my heating, so do you really think that the present government has actually got a really positive view on the issue, and whether the noise that Boris Johnson has been making is really way above the ability to actually deliver such an enormous cut in the space of a few years and trying to lead. So basically 2 questions: the role of the EU and the extent to which the UK and the noise that it's making is merely a noisy neighbour rather than necessarily a true attempt to actually lead global Britain towards climate change. So 2 points.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I mean, you will know that. I mean, the EU is really important in climate change politics because it has attached. I mean, one of the things that the EU has done over the years is to make climate change one of its key objectives as an EU, as opposed to the member states. And it's an area in which it's been quite successful in burnishing its reputation as an independent, as an actor, because it's an area. It's not like trade where there's exclusive competence, but there is shared competence for climate change, and many tussles have occurred in Brussels over, who leads on it. Basically, at the moment, there's a joint shared leadership. But the EU has been very important. I mean, right from the beginning, it was the EU that pressed for actual cuts in 1992, and the Americans wouldn't have it in the original convention. It then went on to at the time of Kyoto, the Kyoto mechanism was, these market-based mechanisms, was right against the EU regulatory tradition, but the EU embraced it and produced the world's first emissions trading system, the ETS, the emissions trading scheme that it brought in. And the other thing the EU did, said how difficult the negotiations were to implement Kyoto, particularly over all this MRV stuff with it's all acronyms of the CDM. The EU did this. It's amazing. The Americans were nowhere. The Chinese weren't committed to it, didn't have to do anything. The EU led Kyoto, the great advocate of Kyoto. So the EU has been very important in the development of all this. The French and the EU, were important at Paris. Copenhagen was a bit of a setback, but fundamentally, structurally, the EU is a big part. Is a big part of dealing with climate change. The other angle of the EU is the EU is collectively the biggest aid giver. So if you're talking about north-south flows of finance, the EU is there. So I wouldn't underestimate the role of the EU in all of this. And I think it's as I've said now, it's a net loss for the UK that we're not sitting in Brussels making EU policy. And the EU has got a policy. I mean, the Green New Deal, 50% plus reductions by 2030. It's got a policy and it's got mechanisms to deal with it. It's got the ETS and burden sharing and so on. So it has got worked out mechanisms. As far as the UK is concerned, yeah, I mean, it's just so mixed, isn't it? You can see the reputational advantages for the EU, for the UK of having a successful outcome in Glasgow. And I've heard it said that one of the things that might sway Boris Johnson in terms of actually going for a physical COP is because he will be able to shine. He'll be able to go glad hand everybody and say, look, these great, we've resolved Article 6 and we've got, and we've managed to persuade the Chinese to, sign up to a better NDC and the Americans. You can see it all, how it will happen. So, I mean, he has huge reputational advantages. Now, whether, again, we're coming back to trust and credibility, whether people believe this, I don't know. I mean, and does it matter that, in terms of this ratchet mechanism, that people would look at the British and say, well, what about the coal mine? What about this? What about that? But as I say, we're not the only ones who don't have a particularly worked out domestic strategy for achieving our NDCs. It's one of the weaknesses of this system, I think. You set your own homework and you mark it. I mean, I can't emphasize this. It's a top-down. Kyoto was top-down. You sign up, and it's a legally binding, enforceable thing, and you get monitored. Have you reduced it? This is, well, we'll put something on the table, and how should we specify it so we can hit this target? And in order to really have this system work, you'd have to be very intrusive and look at precisely what governments are doing internally. And they can only do that to a certain extent. with monitoring, reporting, and verification. So yeah, there are real problems with that. But how, I don't know how much it actually will affect the way the ratchet operates. I mean, there is some evidence it's operating a bit, that you're getting better contributions, mustn't say commitments, contributions. But but I say it's really worrying, because they're doing road building, and they've cut the insulation grants for home, for insulating people's homes, and so it's, I'm sure this goes on elsewhere as well, that you've got to try and pull together all these policies, because I think the big picture is that, and I think the government maybe realizes that the big picture in the long term is economic welfare is going to be part of a decarbonized economy, the way things are going. I mean, for me, that's the big change that's occurring in climate politics. And the government have got to get on board with this, I think. I think they have to a certain extent. I mean, they're quite good in some areas, but not in others.
Not in all of them. Yeah. Thank you so much for this. Now we are going to invite questions and comments from our attendees. So I'll stop the recording now. Thank you so much, Professor John Vogler. Now we're going to wait for some contributions from and questions perhaps from our audience.